So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you for accepting our invitation. This maybe it's not known, this is a special place because this is a completely independent and free place. And in the meantime, it's sometimes complicated in Vienna to get for special topics and for special lecturers, places. And so our magazine, we took the decision already a few months ago where we had also here a book presentation by Charlotte Wiedemann, a very good book about history. And so we took the decision, if it's a little bit anti-mainstream, we as magazine, we don't take the risk to go somewhere and to be confronted 2 or 3 days, like the peace conference a few days ago, that somebody who said, yo, you can come and you are welcome. We can't keep our promises. So, and since the speaker of this night, which is for me a pleasure, an honor to welcome Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey, thank you for coming first. And I think for you, obviously, it's already usual that you are, in the meantime, a very dangerous person. And it's risky for people to talk to you, to interview you, and then you speak to wrong people and to wrong media outlets. And so that's the reason why we are with events like this in a completely free and independent location where we pay a rent and we decide what to do and how to do. And in that sense, thank you for coming. And this brings me just for 2 comments on our magazine. I think our magazine is already, it was established 1979 and we're still living and we are doing not so badly. But we try to be really independent. We have no sponsors, we have no lobbies behind us, and we try, especially in times like this. It started already, the similar experience a few years ago when this stupid pandemic started. It became sometimes very ridiculous and very dangerous even to speak out what you are thinking. And now this is the continuation now. I think I have the feeling there is still a virus in the world. Maybe the virus is now affecting in another way, but this is now a virus that you not even can dare to speak out, that there is a conflict, and the conflict has history, and the conflict has not only good and bad guys. I think mainly the color in the world is gray and not red and not white, or black and white, and we try to speak out. We are a free, independent magazine. By the way, I got a request today by one of you. He asked me, will there be a debate? And I responded, I didn't respond what I was thinking. I said, what are you asking for? I think we are not, I don't know, the government or a party or something like. I think everybody is allowed to speak out here. Everybody is protected within certain limits, that's clear, but the limits are sometimes not like this, like this. So we try to speak out and to discuss. And sometimes we provoke, because we are, even in Austria, we have some guests from overseas. I think you don't know exactly the situation here in Austria. Just explained a little bit. The media and the public situation in Vienna is a little bit tricky. The Austrians, they don't play the direct game usually. Yes? They prefer to have the indirect game, which is sometimes more painful and more dangerous, because sometimes you don't know where the attacks comes from. Yeah? And sometimes it's better to know your enemy and then you can confront him. But our policy as independent left-wing magazine is we have a certain position, but we don't criminalize people who has other positions. Then we invite them and come and say, confront, discuss. And this is something I hope we will have today. I think we will have for sure an excellent presentation, an excellent, interesting debate. And then it's up to you to ask, to make any comments as you like, as long as it's in a way which is acceptable from human being behavior. In that sense, again, thank you very much for coming. And now I invite Professor Sachs and Professor Gärtner to come here and to start the program. Thank you very much again.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Fritz Edlinger. I also want to thank the magazine International for inviting Professor Sachs. Welcome again. What we do here is looking for explanations and solutions, and Professor Sachs is the right person to do so. I will not read out a lengthy CV. It would be too long, but some key points, and I still have to read it. Professor Sachs is Professor for Sustainable Development and Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University. He's Director of Columbia's Center for Sustainable Development at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He has served as a special advisor to 3 Secretaries General. He has numerous books, of course, writing about the end of poverty, Commonwealth, the age of sustainable development, and also on US foreign policy, a new foreign policy beyond American exceptionalism, and much, much more. So what we do is looking for explanations, which is an legitimate yet indispensable academic endeavor. We have to learn lessons for the future. So what we don't do is justify the Russian invasion, which was illegal and politically wrong. However, looking for answers why this happens, that's why we are here today. And before we are discussing the road to peace, like the title of this event, I would ask Professor Sachs some questions about the road to war. So the procedure here is he will ask several questions. Professor Sachs will answer. And at the end, we will have, as Fritz Edlinger said, sufficient time for discussion and Q&A. So road to war, Professor Sachs, we have several explanations here out there. So starting from Putin's personality to imperial conquest, to more structural explanations like hegemonic competition. So we have this range of explanations. So where would you stand? Is it personality? Is it imperialism? Is it more hegemonic competition of great power competition, as we say it? So that's the first question.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm told to be very brief so that we can discuss a lot. So I'll give somewhat brief answers, because if I get going, it's going to be a long evening for you. I believe the war started 9 years ago, not last year. I think it started in February 2014. It started with the violent overthrow of President Yanukovych, which I attribute to a significant extent to U.S. Participation in a regime change operation in Ukraine. And to my mind, that really was the trigger of this war, meaning that we are basically seeing a proxy war between the United States and Russia, plus both sides playing on the very aggravated ethnic divisions within Ukraine. So Ukraine is a divided country, ethnically, historically, but that meant that there was competition between the United States and Russia for control, for influence, even for putting military bases and the US-NATO alliance. And I view the lack of prudence by both sides, but since I'm an American, I will focus on the lack of American prudence as being absolutely central to this. If the United States had sense, and by the United States, I don't mean the American people, they're never asked about any of these things. This has nothing to do with the American people. This is to do with a small group in Washington, in power. You could call it the military-industrial complex. It's a fair name for it. They don't have prudence, and we are at war because of that lack of prudence, in my view. I don't think anything specific about Putin's personality plays any important role in this. I don't think that this is some idea of recreating the Russian Empire. By the way, we hear lots of things in the mainstream media which to my mind are completely unrecognizable regarding the truth. And just one more small point. I was economic advisor to President Gorbachev. I was economic advisor to President Yeltsin. And I was an economic advisor to President Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine. I didn't choose sides. I liked them both. There's no reason why this war needed to happen, but I'll focus, because of being an American, on the lack of sense of the military-industrial complex in the United States. And I think that that was a major, major cause of this war.
You said personality doesn't really play that role, so you mentioned NATO and probably you said structural causes and hegemonic competition. And of course, Russia's perception is that Russia wanted to wall off NATO. So he was not really successful, because now NATO is everywhere. So NATO, Finland and Sweden are joining NATO, and NATO troops are permanently deployed in Poland and the Baltic states. Right now we have a huge NATO military maneuver in Germany, and also Putin wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, and now Ukraine is the most militarized country in Europe. Was Putin's decision a big geopolitical blunder?
Well, it's a big geopolitical tragedy. What happens from now still remains to be seen. And let me be clear about the NATO issues. It's my, it's without doubt the American plan to expand NATO to Ukraine already in the mid-1990s, well before there was Putin as president. It is my understanding from a discussion with one of our leading historians recently that the plan to expand NATO to Ukraine was made in 1992, basically within weeks or months of having promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. So this is not something new. It's not something about Putin. It's something that predates Putin. There's a fascinating article by Zbigniew Brzezinski in Foreign Affairs magazine, which is our establishment foreign policy magazine, in 1997, where he spells out the timeline to NATO enlargement, to Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and Ukraine almost precisely in 1997, because this was a US plan at the top levels. When an article is written like that, that's not just an opinion of an author, that's informing the elite opinion in the United States what the real plan is. So this was in the works for decades. And the specific idea about NATO, spelled out by Brzezinski both in Foreign Affairs and in a book called The Global Chessboard that he wrote in 1997, is to surround Russia in the Black Sea region. This is out of the playbook of Britain and France in 1853 to 1856. It's almost reliving the Crimean War. The idea of the Crimean War was that Palmerston wanted to kick Russia out of the Black Sea. Brzezinski had a similar idea in the mid-1990s. The US neoconservatives had a similar idea back to 1992. If Ukraine and Georgia become NATO members, then if you look at the map, you see that Russia is surrounded by Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. Even the idea of expanding NATO to Georgia, to me, is the giveaway. Last time I checked, Georgia is not a North Atlantic country. It's in the Caucasus. What in heaven's name is NATO doing in Georgia? This is where things really went awry. It is official US doctrine. It's surprisingly official, by the way, because you can find it in many, many documents, that the US goal is to be the dominant power in all parts of the world. To my mind, no thanks. That doesn't make me feel any safer. It just means endless wars when 4.1% of the world population presumes that it's going to dominate the world. But this, I believe, was part of US foreign policy at the core already for decades. And NATO enlargement is part of this. There's something particular about Ukraine. It is 2,000 kilometers of border with Russia. It is, from Russia's point of view, a direct security risk to Russia. I would take the same view as a Russian, and I would take the same view as an American vis-a-vis Russia. I actually don't want Mexico to have a military alliance with China. I don't want Mexico to have a military alliance with Russia. And I don't want the United States to have a military alliance with Ukraine for the same reasons. It doesn't make the world safer.
If NATO expansion was one of the main causes for the decision by Russia to invade Ukraine, because, of course, of the fear that it might be a similar situation as we had to the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, that NATO missiles would be deployed there. However, there have been several proposals since 2008. There was the Bucharest summit when NATO promised Ukraine and Georgia will become NATO members, but not later than 2014 for a neutrality of Ukraine. So neutrality defined no NATO membership, but at the same time the withdrawal of Russian-supported militias in the east. So could have a neutral Ukraine avoided the war? Why was it discarded? Of course, since 2019, we know that Ukraine has the NATO membership in its constitution. Before 2008, there was some forth and back independence, neutrality, NATO membership. But not later than 2005, NATO membership was an aspiration by Ukraine. So if Ukraine would have defended or presented a credible neutrality, could the war have been avoided?
Of course, it could have, and Austria's history is a glorious demonstration of the success of neutrality. Austria was not threatened in the years from 1955 onward by being a non-NATO neutral country. Austria regained its sovereignty and the Soviet Union went home. And incidentally, the Soviet Union went home in 1955 because not only was the state treaty signed in the Belvedere agreed and the neutrality declared by the parliament of this country, but also the Soviet Union was saying to the United States, do this for Germany and the Cold War ends. Make Germany neutral. What is this NATO business? This is a threat to us. Germany claimed 20 million lives of our citizens. Why are you rearming Germany? And our greatest statesman, practitioner of the day, one of our great historian diplomats in modern history, George Kennan, said at that moment, use the Austrian example. Have a neutral Germany and tell the Soviet Union, go home, out of Central Europe, out of Eastern Europe. Now you don't need that buffer zone because Germany is neutral. The United States would have nothing of it. The United States has never believed in it. You were lucky they weren't paying attention. But for Germany, no way. We were going to have NATO. The end of the 1950s, Eisenhower even said, give them nuclear weapons. That's okay. And that is why in a series of horrible events, we nearly arrived at nuclear Armageddon with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States has a very hard time thinking through the eyes of anyone else. And when I say US, I'm meaning literally a small group of a few hundred people. I'm not speaking about the American people. They're not told anything about this. And just as a footnote, I've tried to explain the role of NATO in this to the New York Times, and they will not print anything on this. They've written 26 editorials since February 24th, 2022, that this is an unprovoked war. I called them, I wrote to them, I said, I've advised all these leaders, these countries, I've been through this for 3 decades. Can you give me 700 words? The answer is no. There's a complete unwillingness to have any discussion about this. Because if you do, you're put on Ukraine's blacklist and you're put on America's no-show list in the mainstream media. It's really quite something. One more thing that's worth everybody understanding. This is not about Democrats and Republicans. This is not at all about partisan politics. Biden is no different from so many other presidents. It's not, this one's crazy, this one's not crazy. They're all a little bit, but this is about really state policy in the deepest structure in Washington. And it's the Armed Services Committees, it's the very $900 billion military budgets. You have to test your weapons, believe me. You need wars not so infrequently. You have to be ready. You have to teach China a lesson. In the minds of this small group, this war is as much about China as it is about anything else. Isn't that surprising? It's hard to think the way they think, but you cannot actually discuss this in the United States right now, in the mainstream. Of course, there are 1,000 outlets to discuss things, but not in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, MSNBC, CNN. Forget it.
Let's go a step further. You mentioned Austria and compared it to Germany. Austria was lucky, maybe prudent, as you say, to get its permanent neutrality. Germany was permanently divided, if you say it's several decades. So we know this from history that wars end where the armies stand. So, and then you always have a division of territory. So we know this from the end of the Cold War. In Tehran, 1943, they decided to build the blocks where basically the armies after the Second World War were deployed. Now we have a situation in a little bit an sort of Iron Curtain, a little bit more east. So we have an Iron Curtain from the Arctic. Finland, Sweden is joining NATO, and this Iron Curtain is going right through Ukraine down to the Black Sea. Do you see for Ukraine now a permanent division like for Germany or for Korea? Or do we see a permanent war, since I guess permanent neutrality is not the option anymore for Ukraine?
I would say we don't know what the options are, because there has been no diplomacy between the United States and Russia since this war began. As far as I know, President Biden and President Putin have not spoken one time since February 24th, 2022. I find that worse than school children, by the way. It's hard for me to understand how the world can be at the brink of nuclear war. And I could send them a link if they want, so they could get on Zoom. I could even give them a phone call. I'd lend them my phone. It's not so hard. But they don't talk. This is somehow sophisticated. This is absolutely mind-boggling. Of course, you need to talk. You need to understand the other side. Maybe you won't agree. More likely, you'll find a modus vivendi or a modus operandi to get beyond this. It could be, in the end, many things could be. So I don't have a prediction. Ukraine could be divided. We could have nuclear war. We could have Ukraine be neutral and Russia go home from most of Ukraine, though I don't think it's going to leave Crimea for a lot of reasons now. But lots of things could happen. We should understand that in December 2021, the idea that Russia would annex the Donbass wasn't mentioned once. What Russia wanted was that the Minsk II agreements would be honored. Now, that's quite interesting. The Minsk II agreements declared that there would be autonomy for the Lugansk and Donetsk, for eastern Ukraine, the Russian dominant ethnic group, signed by Ukraine and voted 15-0 by the UN Security Council and guaranteed by France and Germany. Do you know what my Ukrainian friends, well, they don't regard me as a friend anymore, but what they tell me? Of course we'd never honor that, as if it's a joke. And then when Russia says, well, this was not honored, we say, what difference? Russia doesn't believe in diplomacy. And now the sentence that I just uttered proves that I'm a Putin lover. You know, in other words, we're in a cycle of bizarre arguments. The truth is actually rather straightforward. The United States participated in the overthrow of Yanukovych. A Russophobic government came to power. They immediately declared the intention, immediately means within 2014, to join NATO. Arms shipments from the United States accelerated. The Minsk agreements were signed. The Ukrainian government ignored them. Chancellor Merkel explained afterwards, she explained to us last year that she ignored them completely. In 2021, December 17, President Putin put on the table a draft US-Russia security agreement, which had two major points that Putin was emphasizing. One is that the Minsk agreement should be carried out. And the second was that NATO would not enlarge. And the United States said, we don't negotiate with you over those things. And it's NATO doctrine. What we do is no third country's business. As if Castro said, what business is it of you, United States, just before we invaded in the Bay of Pigs and also nearly had the world blown up over the Cuban Missile Crisis. If the tables are turned just a little bit, believe me, the explosion that you would hear of any of the claims that the United States makes. So that kind of hypocrisy and arrogance also is very grating on most of the rest of the world. We make wars when we want. We can invade Afghanistan. We can invade Iraq. We can try to overthrow Assad, and have no doubt that was not a civil war. That was a U.S. regime change operation signed by the President of the United States to the CIA called Operation Timber Sycamore. We can overthrow Gaddafi with the NATO in the end of 2011. We can overthrow Yanukovych. We can do what we want. Why are you complaining? We are a peace-loving defensive alliance. And so this doesn't work. And this is why we don't know what can happen, because I keep claiming, I'll claim it again, President Biden did what a US president should do. First picked up the phone or hit the Zoom button and talked to his counterpart and said, you go home and we won't fill in the void with NATO. Lots of good things could happen. So I don't rule out anything, but it takes two to make a negotiation. Incidentally, one more point, sorry to run on. In March 2022, Russia and Ukraine negotiated an end to the war. Did you know that? They negotiated. What happened? What happened? Excuse me? No, that's not what happened. Okay, Bucha may or may not have happened, but that's not what happened at the negotiating table. What happened at the negotiating table was the United States told them, don't negotiate. That's what the United States told them. This is now from multiple directions clear. And if you want to hear a very interesting description of this that shows how bizarre this is, Naftali Bennett, who was then Prime Minister of Israel and an informal mediator, said we were in the 7th draft and they were just about reaching an agreement. And then the United States stopped it. And he said, I don't think they should have stopped it, but they thought it was important about China. Are you kidding? It takes a certain imagination to think that way. But that's what happened. And I've heard that from all sides. So this is really not beyond our reach to have a negotiated outcome to this. Not at all beyond our reach.
Let me push you a little bit on this. On the one hand, you're saying all options are possible, so you don't know what. But on the other hand, you're saying, no, diplomacy does not really work now anymore. So what are the real end result here? So Karl of Clausewitz, he said, a war always pushes to the extremes unless there's a peace agreement or a total defeat of the adversary. Neither of these options are in sight at the moment. So fighting continues. What are these extremes when it comes on? No diplomacy, decision made on the battlefield. Would it creep to an open, all-out war? Is this a possibility, including maybe nuclear weapons?
There are many theories of what's going to happen on the battlefield, but before I get to them, just to say that Clausewitz's most famous observation, I think, applies here perfectly, which is that war is the continuation of politics with other means. This is political issues that we're talking about here, which means that there is a way to resolve these issues politically, not militarily. That's key. If this was the delusions of a madman, this would be different. But this is politics. It's politics about Ukraine, and it's politics about NATO. And so this is susceptible of a negotiated outcome. I would not give up on that at all. Now, what could happen, many things could happen. The one thing that cannot happen, in my opinion, is that Russia is defeated. And the reason is that if Russia were to lose in a conventional sense, I believe Russia would likely escalate to nuclear war. Because my understanding of this issue is that Russia views this issue as existential for Russia, not as haphazard, and not as a flight of fancy, not as a dream world of Peter the Great, not as recreating the Russian Empire, but as an existential threat to Russia. Whether it is or is not, it's viewed that way. And Putin is hardly the hardest of the hardliners in Russia, by the way. There are many who resent the fact that he has not escalated much harder and much faster, which is within Russia's means. So one possibility is that Russia wins on the battlefield in the next months. This could really happen, incidentally, because in a war of attrition, a much, much larger and powerful country has a propensity to win. And because apparently, although I'm no expert on this, it is said that NATO stockpiles, including US stockpiles, are running very low, that scaling up of US military production will take years, and that even an article in Politico, which is a kind of right-wing daily in the United States, said the Pentagon is freaking out over the depleted reserves because our real war is with China, they say. So it's really possible that Russia has a significant victory on the battlefield. Okay, that could mean all sorts of things. It could mean NATO escalation, in which we ratchet things further, or it could mean that there's some negotiation or frozen lines or armistice or Ukraine divided in two or something else. Okay, that's one possibility. Another possibility is that Ukraine wins significantly in this counteroffensive, although, actually I won't say although, suppose that it did. Is Russia going to say, oh, we made a mistake, we go home? I doubt it. I think Russia would escalate further. And Russia has 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons, including tactical nuclear weapons. I'm told every day, oh, don't be blackmailed by nuclear weapons. People who say that have no idea of the history of the nuclear age. If you're not terrified of gambling with that, you don't know the history. I'm terrified of it. So if Russia were to be losing in a conventional war, I would be terrified right now of what would come next. And the idea that we had a story last week in the Washington Post, by the way, which said Biden, I'm paraphrasing, has decided he can ignore more and more of Putin's red lines because so far it's all been bluff. My God. The best book about the Cuban Missile Crisis ever written was a book called Gambling with Armageddon. That's what they're doing. And I know the people doing the gambling, you wouldn't want to bet the world on them, by the way. I know them personally. Don't bet the world on them. So this is where we are. Lots of things are possible, but one thing that is absolutely possible is that Biden picks up the phone and says, you know, we should consider a way to end this thing without blowing up the world, with you going home, and with NATO not enlarging. That's what I would like to see.
You said nuclear weapons, of course, Russia might use or might threaten with nuclear weapons, but at the moment it doesn't really seem that Russia will have a decisive victory on the battlefield. So wasn't there a Russian miscalculation in the first place? So Russia did not increase military spending decisively before the war. All other imperial powers did in the history. Russia did not. He invaded Ukraine with 180,000 soldiers. Compared to the US deployed 800,000 soldiers in 1992 in Kuwait to liberate Kuwait. Kuwait is 40 times smaller than Ukraine. So wasn't it as a military miscalculation by Putin in the first place, and now the last option, what remains, are the nuclear weapons? Was this not a dangerous gambling on the side of Putin as well?
Aren't we just witnessing a game of chicken on both sides? Isn't that what we're doing? That each side thinks they can bluff the other, and each side calls the bluff of the other. The United States thought that they could get rid of Yanukovych, no consequence. That's what the U.S. thought. The U.S. has overthrown dozens of governments. It's really a bad habit. They forgot diplomacy. What they learned, learned it from the British, by the way, that if you don't like your counterpart, overthrow them. So you forget that there's diplomacy. You don't have to deal with them, you have to subvert them. So they thought that they could overthrow Yanukovych, no consequence. Putin grabbed Crimea like he told George Bush he would. Okay? And the Russian parts of the Ukrainian army broke away in eastern Ukraine, took the weapons with them, and started this, the People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. And by the way, OSCE observers and NATO observers say this was not Russian weapons coming in. I wasn't there. It said this was Ukrainian weapons taken from within the Ukrainian army to create these two breakaway regions. That led to the Minsk agreements. Putin thought maybe that will be the way that this will stop. There will be autonomy for these two regions, Crimea will be ours, that would have probably stopped this war. But Minsk wasn't honored. When President Biden came in, Putin said, stop, stop. And Biden said, no, why stop? Ukraine's going to become a member of NATO. And during 2021, the United States 3 times signed very high-level documents committing the U.S. to NATO enlargement to Ukraine. On December, and then Putin massed troops on the border and put forward this draft document on December 17th. He thought, I think that would lead to negotiations. I called the White House 2 weeks after that, spoke to a senior official at length. I said, negotiate, avoid a war, negotiate. It's not even a concession not to expand NATO. It's common sense not to expand NATO. And I was told, no, we'll never negotiate over that. So Putin thought that that would work. It failed. So he launched the invasion on February 24th. What was he expecting then? My view is he was expecting a quick negotiation. Why do I surmise that? Because 3 weeks later, there was a quick negotiation. 3 weeks later, Zelensky said, we don't have to be part of NATO. We can be neutral. Go look it up, ladies and gentlemen. That was Putin's idea. Okay, we've shown we mean business. Now we'll have a negotiated outcome based on neutrality. But the US called that bluff, said, no way. We tell our client, you don't negotiate, which is exactly what happened. So they called the bluff. And that, with sanctions and us doubling down, Putin will back off. No, Putin mobilized in the summer of 2021, 300,000 more people. He called the bluff. Okay, we'll send tanks and F-16s. We'll call the bluff. Come on. All of us have been in 6th grade. That's what we're witnessing. Except they're playing with nuclear weapons. This is clear. By the way, not only clear, at least to me, I said exactly this to US officials all through this process. Because for a while, they would even talk to me. Because I know them. I've been around. And I said, this is deep for Russia. And by the way, all of our best diplomats have said the same thing for 30 years. William Burns, who's very bright and now CIA director, in 2008 was the US ambassador to Russia. He sent a famous memo. The memo is called Niet, means Niet. He explained that the entire Russian political class is dead set against NATO enlargement to Ukraine. Niet means Niet. And he said it's no joke. But of course, American politicians don't listen to this. Bill Perry, our defense secretary, said, don't expand NATO. George Kennan said in 1997, that this is going to lead to disaster. You can look it up in the New York Times, it's on the website. This is all predictable. They behave like kids. Raytheon lobbies for more sales. All the think tanks in Washington are gung-ho for U.S. unilateral prerogatives. Every article in Foreign Affairs magazine is about what they call U.S. primacy, so it's all about how can we stay number one. As an economist, it's not even a question I ask, by the way. The question an economist asks is how can we have a win-win economy of trade? But if you're a strategist, it's who's on top. That's what counts. To me, it's back to 6th grade. But for them, each side's calling each other's bluff. So where's the miscalculation? Both sides. The only absolute disastrous loser is Ukraine in this. And Ukraine had one president who was trying delicately to avoid being engulfed in a proxy war, and that was Yanukovych, and he was overthrown.
I have a couple of more questions before we move on to the Q&A questions, 3 more questions about. Just to respond, of course, the Western perception is different. So the Western perception is that Putin brought war, bloc thinking, and arms race back to Europe. But it seems that the West is more than willing to accept this Putin's reality as a new norm. We have this keyword, Zeitenwende. So it seems to be an agreement that they meet on a much lower level. The higher values like multilateralism, interdependence, arms control, they're all given up also by the West. So it seems that Putin won this narrative. Now we're in a different world. Whoever is responsible, but everybody plays the same game.
The very sad thing for me in watching this is how Europe lost its identity as a political union to become part of NATO. It's something ununderstandable for me, the equation of the EU and NATO. And the fact that President von der Leyen is campaigning to leave the presidency of the European Commission to become head of NATO is an example of how utterly bizarre the situation is. So I'm a professor of sustainable development, and that means that I study not only income levels, but quality of life, health, and many other dimensions of life. I also publish as a co-editor, founding co-editor of an annual report called the World Happiness Report, which uses data collected by Gallup International to assess the subjective assessment of life in more than 150 countries. The reason I mention all of this is Europe has by far the highest living standards on the planet, by far, the highest quality of life, by far, and is most attuned of any region in the world to reducing inequalities, to green transformation, to doing the things we should be doing in the 21st century. That's Europe's vocation, a continent of peace, sustainable development, social equity. That's the genius of the OSCE, that Europe extends all the way to the Urals. I was advisor to President Gorbachev. I knew President Gorbachev. He believed in a common European home, not as some pernicious gimmick, because he really believed in it. And he was a great man of peace, probably the greatest statesman of our age. And the United States could not understand him. They could not take yes for an answer. He's offering peace. What's the trick? He's offering peace. Oh, I get it. We'll be the unipolar world. He's offering to disband the militaries. I get it. We'll extend NATO all the way to the Caucasus. That's the US reaction to the greatest opportunity we had for peace. Europe is losing its greatest achievements in this. Europe is not the junior partner of the global hegemon. Europe doesn't even have the same values as the United States. That's, by the way, literally, objectively so. We're part of the crazy Anglo-Saxon world. We're still with John Locke's libertarianism. We're still with, you don't have to help the poor, they're a burden on society. We have ideas that go back to 17th century Britain, and then we learned from 19th century Britain what global empire means, and decided that that's what our vocation was. Europe is so much better than what it is signing up for right now. This is extremely sad and extremely dangerous. By the way, I understand Poland's sentiments. I was their main economic advisor. I helped them cancel their debts in 1990 and 91. I helped them stabilize their economy. I was their biggest champion for becoming members of the European Union. By the way, it wasn't even the Union then. It was the European Community when I started the campaign. I wrote their first reform program, and I was told that the theme is the return to Europe. That's the instruction I was given by Lech Wałęsa's team. You write a plan for the economic return to Europe. So I've seen all of this. I can understand their Russophobia. I don't accept it as geopolitics or as clever or as an answer. I certainly understand it. My wife was born in communist Czechoslovakia. I have no illusions about the hard attitudes, but we have to think about how we're actually going to have a safe planet. This isn't about sentiment only. It's about some knowledge of history, some ability to see the other point of view, to understand the history, even to understand the history of the Cold War. This country, as I emphasized, is a great lesson that is completely ignored, by the way, as all the neutral states other than Austria abandon their neutrality with such enthusiasm. Big mistake. But my point is, please, Europe is not NATO. Europe is not NATO. And if you knew how crazy it is on the other side of the Atlantic, I'm trying to tell you, they think that their biggest important calling in the world is confrontation with China. Is that what you want to sign up for right now? Don't. Don't do it. You have the best living standards and the best values, I would say. Social democratic values, which even for the non-social democratic parties permeate the idea that people should be taken care of, that there should be social housing, that there should be public. We don't have universal health coverage. You sign up for those values? I wouldn't recommend it. We don't have public values. We have British laissez-faire Lockean libertarian values. I don't recommend it. By the way, it doesn't work very well. I live in an expensive neighborhood in New York that is absolutely filled with beggars, filled with garbage that is not taken care of because the public spaces don't work, and now filled with shootings. Don't do it. And that is an approach that is part of this, even as we're falling apart internally, because we have a mass shooting almost every day, it seems. Sometimes more. Even as this is happening, we're all about war. And when we just had our debt negotiations, you know what the bipartisan agreement was? That the social spending is capped, but the military spending is allowed to rise. Even though we're spending 3 times more than China, and even though we are spending more than the next 10 countries in the world combined, and even though we have 800 military bases overseas around the world. Don't sign up for that. Europe is different from NATO.
But at the moment, it doesn't seem like that, because, of course, you said Europe's vocation. Europe's vocation is, of course, effective multilateralism, but what we are moving towards, it's a polarization. So some call it a multipolar world, but the multipolar world without multilateralism is very dangerous. We had multipolar worlds before the First and the Second World War. So my question would be, how could multilateralism be regained? So to combine it to Russia, should a European security system be constructed with Russia, without Russia, or against Russia? Should Russia be integrated in a multilateral world, and how would we do it? So you mentioned the OSCE. Would the CSC of 75 be an example? So how could a multilateral world without polarization or without too much polarization look like? Do you have any models, ideas?
I was very keen on the European Union enlargement and played a major role in it in the early years because I believe that neighbors should cooperate with each other. And so I really like the OSCE framework. I think it's right, and I think it is proper for Europe to have a European security arrangement. All over the world, the regions are divided internally. Typically Cold War divisions, often on a strategy, imperial US strategy of impera et divide. So we want division. The US is stoking divisions in Northeast Asia. China, Japan is on our side. I'm sorry, Japan and Korea are on our side. China's on the other side. We're forging a new military alliance, AUKUS, as you know, which is Australia, US, UK for nuclear submarines in Australia. Just what we need, just what Australia needs. What the solution is, each region should cooperate, and African Union should cooperate internally. Europe should, of course, aim to include Russia. Of course, are you kidding? How could it not be, other than to fall under the nuclear threat day by day again? So all of this cancel culture is mind-boggling in how wrong-headed it is. By the way, even the New York Philharmonic canceled a Rachmaninoff concert for May. You can't even imagine how, I could never imagine how crude this is. This is high culture. They can't figure out to play Rachmaninoff and that's okay. Or there were protests about Tchaikovsky, about don't play Sleeping Beauty at Christmas time. Even here, it was an issue. Please, what is more beautiful than Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty? Maybe a few Strauss waltzes also. Okay, I would say that they're right up there. But we should not be behaving this way. And the demonization makes nobody safe. It solves no problems. It puts everybody on a hair trigger, and we are in a nuclear age. And so this is my basic idea is UN Charter and regional cooperation and globally agreed goals, Sustainable Development Goals, Paris Climate Agreement, UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, the High Seas Treaty, the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. In other words, let's actually take care of people and the planet. Instead of the $2.2 trillion spent last year on military armaments, if we could get a bit of that to get kids in school, we'd make a much better world for the hundreds of millions of children who are not in school because their governments are too broke to be able to afford high schools for them. So this is what we should be doing. We actually have globally agreed goals. We have the OSCE. We have the means to do this. US politicians should not fly to Taiwan and declare that we're going to defend Taiwan at all costs. We had agreed 50 years ago to a one China policy, and that's the right policy. And China believes in that because starting in 1839, the Western imperialist powers, followed by Japan, tried to destroy China on several occasions or to conquer China. So they're not too keen on that happening again. I understand that. We should have some prudence. So we're not so far away from a peaceful world because the vast majority of people in the world want it. And we don't really have, China, by the way, is not aiming to take over the world. That's another long evening. I have gone to China for 42 years, many times a year on many cases. It's the last thing in the world that I'm worried about, is China taking over the world. It's not even a category. In 2,000 years of Chinese statecraft, China has not launched one overseas war. 2,000 years. The one that you could count is when the Mongols controlled Beijing and launched an invasion of Japan in, I think, 1274, though I may have the date wrong, and the kamikaze winds, a typhoon, defeated the Mongol fleet. Other than that, never. You know, Britain and France fought with each other almost every year for 1,000 years, one way or another. But Japan and China never, except Japan invading China on 3 occasions, never China invading Japan. So don't worry so much about China. Really don't. Nice place, good food, fascinating culture. Go have a visit.
All right. So before I ask you the very last question, I just want to add to your observation. There was China, Taiwan, in the last survey of the European Council of Foreign Relations, which is a transatlantic think tank. There was a poll asking citizens, not government, citizens of the European Union, if it comes to a conflict between the US and China over Taiwan, 65% of the Europeans would say, 60 to 65% would say they rather would stay neutral instead of siding with China or even siding with the US. So European citizens might think differently than their governments. But I cannot avoid asking this very last question now, because you're sitting here as an American, and you also wrote a piece about the link between war and debt. And debt is accumulating in the US. And in the US, there will be elections next year. So will the debt crisis have an impact on the decision to support Ukraine by the next government?
U.S. politics is basically a plutocratic state where public policy has been taken over by several powerful lobbies, each one devoted to its specific area. And they keep the control over U.S. policy through campaign contributions, because our election campaigns are funded by billionaires and by corporate lobbies. And they cost about $15 billion now for an election cycle. And you may have seen George Soros yesterday said, I give my empire to my son. And the son said, I'm going to fund the Democratic Party. Well, that's the billionaires that he'll put in hundreds of millions of dollars. $1 billion would not be surprising in the 2024 election. And then there are other billionaires. And so what are the lobbies? Wall Street controls financial policy, and our health lobby controls our unbelievably expensive private so-called health system, and our ag lobby controls the food industry with about 60% obesity or overweight in the United States, another huge, very serious public health crisis. And the military-industrial complex controls foreign policy. Not just military policy, foreign policy. So we have perpetual war and trillion-dollar military budgets. $900 billion in the Pentagon budget, but there's a lot more. There's the CIA, and there's Homeland Security, and there are many other categories, Department of Energy with nuclear weapons and so on. It's maybe $1.2 trillion a year. So that's on the spending side. On the revenue side, we have unanimous agreement among the billionaires. Don't tax us. It's very simple. So we have a low tax collection in the United States, and this spending on the military, for example, which has cost about $6 trillion in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and some of the other wars. $6 trillion. It's a lot, by the way. It starts to add up a little bit. And so our debt crisis comes from a broken political system. It's not so interesting, Democrats and Republicans, by the way. That's a little bit a children's game. The oligarchy is, the plutocracy is both parties. And I lost interest in the because it's basically a game that is below our intelligence. And this is our problem. Now, we will have rising debt in the future. It's a big country, big economy. We can spend a lot on wars. There's been no public debate for a moment on the $120 billion that has been spent so far. This has all been just bits and pieces inside omnibus legislation. So we can't get a debate on anything because there is no debate. There'll have to be another appropriation for Ukraine. They'll try to put it in a must-pass bill so that it's not really debated and can just be snuck in, because there's no interest in asking the American people anything about any of this. There's no attempt at deliberative democracy at all. No debate at all. So the answer to the question is I'm not sure, because there probably has to be another vote, but they will try to make the vote so that nobody notices, and it's just part of some omnibus legislation that funds Social Security something or other. It's not, won't be Social Security, but it'll be something that has to pass and it'll just get through. That's how it's done in general. If it came to an actual vote, it would probably be defeated. If there was actually a debate in Congress, do we really want to spend another $50 or $100 billion on this? It would probably lose. They know that, but they have the convenience of avoiding any kind of public debate.
All right, thank you so much. So we have some more time to exploit your knowledge.
Dr. Sachs, we in Canada are deeply grateful to you for having the courage to speak out like you are. I'm from Canada. I'm here in Vienna to attend the International Summit for Peace in Ukraine that was organized by a number of important international peace groups. While I'm here in Vienna for the peace conference, my Prime Minister and Deputy Minister are in Kyiv announcing another $500 million package for weapons to Ukraine to prolong this tragic war. I am wondering what your suggestions and solutions are to end this war and to bring about peace. Thank you.
Second, Humayun. Yeah. Okay. Whenever, please.
Yes. I was surprised when you said you thought if there was a package of money that it would actually not pass, given that every Democrat has gone for as much money as the White House is asking for. And so I wonder if you think that that is changing because public opinion is actually changing. And then I wonder if you could also tell us about your weekend at the Vatican.
Mm-hmm. So, Humayun,
Thank you very much.
microphone.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs, for your excellent explanation. Actually, you are confirming what we think, actually, in that sense. I have two small questions. One is coming back to Professor Hans Gärtner's remark on Minsk Agreement 2 and the idea of neutrality. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of papers within the various institute, think tanks, etc., United States and European countries. My question is, what was the main, or what were the main reasons that they were brought against the neutrality of Ukraine? Because I think this is a major point. Because if the country would have accepted a neutrality, we would not have this disastrous war and suffering over 100,000 people, innocent people and civilians. The second question is coming back to your economic background. I always wonder because looking the last economic development of the United States after the Second World War and II, I think probably you will agree with me that there are a lot of poverties. There are more slums. There are more people who are begging on the street. My question is, why the people are not coming to the street and asking for their rights, for basic rights, not human rights? I mean, of course, economic rights are human rights, but my question is, why the people have not come yet to the street and asking more for their rights? Thanks.
We had a more general statement on peace, then the question on whether the package would pass or not, and the Vatican. I don't know whether you want to say something.
Yeah,
and then the question on neutrality and protest for basic rights. So that's what we...
First, let me say how disappointed I am in Prime Minister Trudeau, and he should know better and act better. By the way, he's very disappointed in me, too. I pointed out some of the limitations of the United States in a meeting, and he was furious with me. So I will reciprocate the frustration. he should know better, but he has signed on, let's say, to the U.S. agenda. And I always considered Canada the sane part of North America. That's a little unfair to Mexico, because Mexico's technically also North America, but of the two countries, I'm a Detroiter originally, so I always viewed Canada as my southern neighbor, because we drove south from Detroit to get to Windsor. But let me just say, I always admired Canada as being kinder, gentler, more rational. And I'm still hoping for something better, because Canada really can do better. And Canadian society, thank God, doesn't have the disasters the United States society has, because it is a kinder, gentler country. But the policies are, you know, there's a large Ukrainian emigre community. It's a powerful voting group. But the big misunderstanding is sending NATO to Ukraine is no friend to Ukraine. It's the biggest disaster. I mean, all of this war is the biggest disaster possible. That's what I tried to explain to my Ukrainian friends for years. Don't get into the middle of a proxy war of the United States. It destroys you. And that's what's happening to Ukraine. So I'm not against Ukraine. I'm trying to save Ukraine, not the way that the United States does it. The United States, quote, claim to want to save Afghanistan. Well, there you have proof positive of what it means when the United States wants to save you. Please don't try that at home. It's really not a good idea. What I meant specifically about the vote, yes, if there's a vote, it'll pass if there's no public debate. But if there is a real public debate, and so this has procedures that it goes through both, it goes through committees in the House. There are witnesses. You testify. I testify. We bring people to Washington. We have an expression of the will of the American people. There's a good chance. And even I'm waiting for Rand Paul and others to just get 40 votes in the U.S. Senate, which would stop this as well. So I think that if this were ever democratized, we would actually have a real chance. The American people do not want this war. This is absolutely clear. And I think that, but they don't give us the chance for that kind of public debate. The U.S. is against neutrality because NATO is U.S. power. That's the basic idea. That is the neocon idea. They call it liberal hegemony. It's a ridiculous idea. But that has been the idea since 1992. And it's deep. As I explained, it's bipartisan. It's basically owned by the military-industrial complex. Victoria Nuland is probably the single best illustration of the deep state aspect of this, because in the early 1990s, or actually in the early 2000s, she was Cheney's security advisor. That's not a good start, by the way. The man who brought us multiple disasters. Then she became, under Bush Jr., the U.S. ambassador to NATO during 2005 to 2008. So she was a key point person in the commitment of NATO to enlarge. Then she became Hillary Clinton's spokesperson. You see, Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. Then she became Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. And she was the person who coordinated the U.S. on the Maidan. And she's the one on the phone call, the fuck Europe phone call. Excuse her language. It's not my language. She's the one on that phone call. Then she's now Undersecretary of State. So this is both parties. This is continuity. This is a strategy. Why does NATO propose to open an office in Japan now? Really? Is NATO the US expeditionary force for the upcoming Taiwan War? What could they conceivably be thinking? Why did the US insist on inviting 4 Asia-Pacific leaders to NATO? Because they have no sense. Because they are looking towards a global war. So why they do this, I think it is what William Fulbright 60 years ago entitled a great book which people should read, The Arrogance of Power. They are drunk with power. And that's what this is about. And they don't know better. They're out of control.
So I have several questions on...
Let me just a quick...
sorry for that.
Yeah, just to say...
the protests on the streets.
Yeah, so...
Basic rights.
Yeah. So the Vatican, unfortunately, was a little outside the Vatican because the Pope had surgery last weekend, it turned out, in the end. And thank goodness he's recovering very well. But we had an event at the auditorium, Ara Pacis, which is the altar of peace under Augustus, just next to the Augustus mausoleum, just across the Tiber from the Vatican. And it was the 60th anniversary of John F. Kennedy's peace speech. And that is a speech I would recommend that everybody listen to again and again. I've made my family listen to it I don't know how many times, but it's the greatest speech by an American leader in modern history. And he gave it 60 years ago, June 10, 1963. And we celebrated that by bringing together Carrie Kennedy, President Kennedy's niece, and Robert Kennedy's daughter, and Nina Khrushcheva, the granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, and Gillian Sorensen, the widow of Theodore Sorensen, who wrote the speech together with President Kennedy. So it was a wonderful occasion. And that speech was a speech at the height of the Cold War, telling the American people we can negotiate peace with the Soviet Union. It was extraordinarily brave, extraordinarily beautiful, extraordinarily wise, and it led to the partial nuclear test ban treaty 5 weeks after President Kennedy gave the speech. And the speech is filled with wisdom that we should take into account. One of the parts of the speech that we should take into account, and let me read you just this excerpt to get it exactly right, because it is extremely important for our survival. If I can find it. One moment. Here it is. Above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. So he said, don't put an adversary at the choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. Well, what is our goal every day? We must defeat Russia. We must humiliate Russia. We must teach Russia a lesson. President Kennedy didn't just say, don't do that. In this long and wonderful speech, he says, above all, we must avoid that. He knew what he was talking about. It was 8 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which nearly ended the world. So above all, we shouldn't be doing precisely what we're doing right now. President Biden should not be taunting Vladimir Putin. The number of times the word humiliating is put with delight in the English language press is really impressive. Russia's humiliation, Russia's humiliation. So what we're doing is exactly the opposite of what President Kennedy urged and what President Kennedy proved could actually lead to peace. So that's what we did in Rome last week.
Okay, I guess with the last round here, oh God, I have a couple of questions on this side. This woman in the back first. I have some reflection here, so I can't really.
Thank you, Professor Gärtner. Ulrike Neuhauser. Sorry. Thank you very much, Professor Sachs, for your very interesting speech and deliberations. That puts me, I was a student at Columbia too for one semester in the late 1980s at Columbia School, yeah. My question would be, so why is President Biden so ill-advised to progress U.S. foreign policy into the 21st century? Why is he staying still in the 20th century? And why is he not furthering or going beyond the advice of the military-industrial complex? I mean, in hindsight, in a few years from now, he would be ill-advised to follow the advice of the people in power behind the scenes. So why is it not possible for President Biden to choose a different path, first of all? And second of all, may I ask you, please, to advise the European Commission in the future on its foreign policy? Please, can we have you here in Europe to help us see what's really happening in the world? Thank you so much.
All right. Mr. Fischer?
You described us the Russian-Ukraine war as a global geopolitical conflict. And when you spoke about the history of this war, you said that American states did many mistakes, especially in misinterpreting the signals coming from Russia and intent. What if they did not do any mistakes, the states? What if there really would be a master plan? You mentioned Mr. Brzezinski, and if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Brzezinski also said the one who is controlling the European-Asian plate will control the world.
That's correct.
If the United States have the wish to be the world's leader, to be the number one in the world, then the competition will not be in China and will not be in Russia. Then Europe is the only reasonable competition. And if we think now that America did no mistakes, if the target was not Russia, if the target was Europe, especially this Europe, if you look back in 2014, this was a perfect economical cooperation between the Russian, between Europe. This all is destroyed now. So I don't see any disadvantage for the American states. So what am I allowed to believe, or is this a conspiracy theory, or is there something behind?
Okay, two more. Mr. Wolfgang Müller.
Thank you very much. Your argument and your narrative is very compelling indeed. To briefly summarize, the United States is guilty for everything. And I don't want to go into details. I just want to rectify some parts of your description of the prehistory of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You repeatedly depict Euromaidan as a violent overthrow, and you said today that it was orchestrated by the Obama administration. Yes, I wrote it down. I wrote it down. It was a violent overthrow, and it was U.S. regime change. I wrote it down. Yes. And well, as you certainly know, this contradicts the majority scholarly opinion, and you're a famous economist. I'm the Russian chair at this university here, and I know many colleagues, and I know what the state of the art is, and it's certainly clear that the Euromaidan was a popular revolution. This does not exclude that there were violent moments included, but it was certainly not an overthrow. And if one looks at revolutionary theory, one sees that something that mobilizes 1 million people on street cannot be a putsch or an overthrow, but is clearly a revolution. Secondly, you referred, and I'm going to try to be very short, to aggravated ethnic tension. And you also mentioned that you are familiar with the situation in Ukraine, as perhaps I am. There is no violence, there is no tension in Ukraine, and there was also no restriction against the usage of Russian language in Ukraine. In fact, before 1991, there were many periods in the Ukrainian history that Ukrainian language and culture were suppressed by the Russian. But after 1991, there was some struggle, political struggle, about allowing the Russian language to be accepted as an official language on a regional level, which was established from 2012 until 2019. And this is the fact that was the legal situation that was valid when Russia started the conflict in 2014. Coming back to this, also neutrality is a point that very repeatedly comes up. In fact, Ukraine was a neutral state when the Russian aggression started in 2014. Ukraine had neutrality officially declared by the Verkhovna Rada under the Yanukovych government, and this was valid under the end of 2014. So neutrality obviously did not save Ukraine from Russian.
Can you be brief?
Yes, this is no question. This is a statement, and since it was. It's a statement, and this is as it was introduced. This is a possibility for open discussion, and I think that it's necessary to rectify some things that are wrong.
How do you have your roots?
That I know it. And I can send you the information. Yes,
please keep
very good. Okay, last point. No diplomacy. As you certainly remember, as do most people here, there was even a U.S. summit, a U.S.-Russian summit in May 2021, in order to prevent this war from happening. So there was diplomacy happening, and until the very last week before the war, many leaders of NATO countries went away to Moscow to even assure in front of running TV cameras the Russian leader that no Ukrainian accession into NATO was imminent. So I needed to say these things, including, of course, French President Macron and German Chancellor Scholz. So these were the main points I wanted to make. Thank you.
All right. So I take one more. Mr. Bayat, have you been?
A very short question. Okay. So, thank you, Professor Sachs, for your excellent presentation. My question goes back to the root cause of all this disastrous conflict. Why Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was not accepted by Europeans, by the West generally? For example, for a clearer, closer economic cooperation and things like that. Thank you.
All right. So we have Biden, the European Commission. We have the master plan here, the global master plan. Then we have more or less, Wolfgang Müller said a lot, but Maidan was the main argument. And yeah, I forgot now what you said.
Yeah. Biden could choose a different course. He has been, however, on the path of NATO expansion for at least a quarter century. So this is not something new. This has been his campaign too. From the 1990s, he was one of the most gung-ho supporters of the military-industrial complex and of NATO enlargement as a senator. And in 2014, he played a personal role in the Maidan events. I think it's, so of course he should choose a different path. I was, by the way, an advisor to Mr. Borrell for a short time, unpaid but official advisor. And then I said one day that I thought that the United States had destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline, and he fired me that day. So that is how my career as advisor to the European Union ended, by my statement, which I still stand by, that the United States most likely destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline. The only competing theory now, by the way, is the one put forward by the United States, which is that Ukraine did it. So take your choice. But I think the United States probably did it, and it's probably not fair to blame Ukraine for this, but it's one or the other. It wasn't Russia. Everybody agrees that it wasn't Russia. In the U.S. intelligence community, their theory is it was Ukraine. That was in the New York Times a few days ago. My theory is Seymour Hersh account that the United States did this. In any event, that brought an end to my illustrious advising the European Commission on foreign policy. Very abruptly, by the way. It took less than a day to end my career in that capacity. So I think the Professor
Müller?
Yes.
But that was the master plan before.
Yeah, I will also say just a word. I think many of our differences are about the Euromaidan. I don't think it's incidental that Victoria Nuland was on tape 3 weeks before the violent overthrow of the government, because it ended with a shooting from the Maidan-controlled buildings and a storming of the government buildings. It was a violent overthrow. And she was on tape describing exactly what the next government would be. So she was planning this change. And I happen to have some direct, odd experience with this. I know that significant U.S. money flowed into the Maidan in ways that are really wrong, seriously wrong. And the United States played a significant role in this. So I don't dispute, of course, that neutrality was not the issue at that point, except for the U.S., which opposed Yanukovych. Yanukovych wanted neutrality. But the U.S. wanted a government that supported NATO enlargement, and it got it in the end, because by the end of 2014, the government was now calling for joining NATO. Of course, you know very, very well as an expert in this that the first act of the parliament, though not implemented, was to ban the Russian language. This brought into... No, is that...
a ban of Russian language. It was a change of the language law for regional minority languages being officially accepted.
That's correct. We agree. We agree. Okay, we agree. Thank you for the clarification. On the U.S. and Europe, I admit my imagination is often not good enough to know what they really have in mind. I don't think this is an anti-Europe venture. of the United States, but it is a hegemonic venture, clearly, because that's not even subtle. The idea of the United States is the United States should have full spectrum dominance in all regions of the world. That's the idea. And of course, the two threats to that perceived by the United States are Russia and China. And so the US foreign policy and strategic policy and defense policy are absolutely clear on these points. And I think that the basic idea is the US likes Europe well enough, but it absolutely wants full dominance over Eurasia. And that's what Zbig was talking about in the global chessboard, how to get full dominance over Eurasia. And he pointed out that control of Ukraine, he called it the geographic pivot of Eurasia. And that was the theory, and he spelled it out in detail, and I think it is the neoconservative vision that has been played out now for 30 years. So I don't think it's per se anti-European. It's not pro-European, it's pro-American. And it is, to my mind, extremely wrong-headed to think when you are 4.1% of the world population that you should run the world or aim to be the unrivaled power of the world, aim to have primacy everywhere. And there's so many vivid examples of how this thinking works. I'll give you one more that is interesting. A former colleague of mine, and then he became a very esteemed ambassador, Robert Blackwell, wrote in 2015 how the United States needed to confront China because China's rise was no longer in America's interest. And he spelled out all the measures that the United States should take to limit China's rise. And they're being followed one by one by one by one. For example, negotiate trade arrangements in Asia that exclude China. What a clever idea. Let's have trade in Asia, but not China, which is the main trade partner of all the Asian countries. Only America could invent such an idea. It's close your eyes, wish 3 times, and sprinkle fairy dust, and good things will happen to you. It's bizarre, but these things are actually spelled out in print and then followed. Ban exports of technology. This was on the list in 2015. Sanctions, using the financial system, setting the rules for various technologies and trade, all spelled out precisely. So this is the question that consumes our international relations specialists. It consumes the think tanks in Washington. It consumes the American leadership, how to stay number one, which is, to me, a very uninteresting question, except that it is so dangerous to have that mindset. And that is, unfortunately, where we are.
Mr. Bayard, what was your question, quick, again?
Oh yes. Yeah. So just to give you a quick personal insight into that, which I did not understand at the time.
Okay. So my question
yes,
was.
Yes, I got it. I got it. Yes. Okay. So I was just going to give you an example. In 1989, I was asked to be economic advisor to Poland's Solidarity movement, and then to its first post-communist government of Prime Minister Mazowiecki. And I mentioned earlier, I drafted a plan for them, and I created a framework for financial stabilization. And I wrote various key steps of that because that was my specialty at the time, and how to stabilize the currency, how to stabilize the financial system, how to stabilize the money, and so forth. the US accepted everything I recommended. In fact, just to show you how it works, one day in September 1989, I had an idea for $1 billion stabilization fund to back the Polish currency. And I literally typed out the idea on one page at 8 in the morning. I went to see Senator Robert Dole, who was the Senate Majority Leader, at 9 in the morning. He told me to return at 10 in the morning, and there was General Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor. He said, Jeffrey, explain it to General Scowcroft, and I did. General Scowcroft asked me, is this the best approach? And I said, I think it is, General. And he said, please call Senator Dole at the end of the day. At 5 p.m., I called Senator Dole, and he said, Jeffrey, tell your Polish friends they have their $1 billion. So it was from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., literally. Okay, now, I made a number of recommendations, and I thought, pretty cool, they're all being accepted. And they worked, which is why President Gorbachev asked me for help. And I suggested similar strategies, multiplied by 5, because that was the difference of the size, actually at the time multiplied by 10, because it was the Soviet Union in 1991. And Gorbachev was invited to the G7, and I and a team at MIT and Harvard presented what was called the Grand Bargain to support Gorbachev. This was even before Russian independence. The White House turned it down flat. Didn't even want a follow-up note or memo, just said, we're not giving anything to the Soviet Union. Okay. Then Gorbachev came back from the G7 and was kidnapped, and in that putsch attempt, and Yeltsin emerged as the dominant political figure. And by September, Yeltsin had reached out to me, please come to Moscow to help us. So I came to Moscow and I explained, they said, how did Poland stabilize its currency? How did Poland get its debt canceled and so forth? And I explained the dynamics. Well, can this work for Russia? Because we're going to have an independent Russia. And I said, it's important because you face financial collapse. And so this is very important. By the way, all my thinking was guided by John Maynard Keynes' Economic Consequences of the Peace, 1919. Don't end a war in disaster for the vanquished. You end up with what everybody knows. You end up with the risk of complete disaster a generation later. So this was very much on my mind, and I proposed a similar strategy for Russia. It was turned down completely. I said, but it already proved itself. The Secretary of State said to my face in early 1992, Mr. Sachs, suppose I even agreed with you on what you're saying. Suppose the Polish finance minister had said the same thing to me that you're saying. I want to give you a piece of advice, Mr. Sachs. It's not going to happen. Okay, very clear. Being very stubborn on my side, I didn't believe him, because usually anything I've wanted, I've had to argue for. But it didn't happen. It never happened. It didn't happen with Bush. It didn't happen with Clinton. The idea of the United States helping Russia to recover never crossed their mind for a moment. This is the most basic point. Russia's on the outside. We move the Iron Curtain several hundred kilometers to the east, but we still face this problem on the other side. That's the mindset.
And the motivation?
The motivation is being number one. The motivation is being number one. By the way, the motivation was we don't have to listen to anybody. We are the unipolar power. We are the most powerful country in the history of the world. And there's a famous, justly famous episode of Wesley Clark, who was the NATO commanding general under Clinton, going to the Pentagon in the early 1990s and being told specifically in 1992, I believe it is, that we're going to clean up now, clean up all those Soviet-backed governments, Iraq, Syria, Libya, blah, blah, blah. We're going to have a series of wars, he was told. And then after 2001, he was told the same thing. Now we can clean up everything. So this is an idea. It's a concept. It's a concept of state power, not a healthy one. And it's been deeply seated, and we're still at it. And these events are playing out in real time right now. They're extremely dangerous, and they're bringing us back to the brink of nuclear war. Because Russia does not want a US-led unipolar world. China does not want a US-led unipolar world. Indeed, outside of the EU, United States, UK, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, nobody else wants a unipolar US world. So we have the West, so-called, with about maybe 15% of the world population, and the rest of the world saying, what are you doing? Could you make peace and calm down rather than breaking everything? Now, let me end by saying I'm not exonerating Russia's responsibilities. I'm saying that we could have avoided this conflict and we could end this conflict now. But we cannot end it on US terms of NATO enlargement. There is no path to that possible. So until we understand that, we will have the risk of escalation and we will have war. The only way to end this is on a path that respects Russia's perceived security interest in not having NATO in Ukraine. And when we accept that, a lot will be possible. Thank you very much.